Excellent, cool. Well, and again, we'll kind of get rolling. And so what we'll kind of do for today, again, this is the third of the meetings that we've been having. The first is covered residential. Last week was kind of commercial impacts and implications of the new zoning code. And then today is really talking about kind of some water body and environmental protections. So we'll give a brief overview about what the new kind of updated zoning code is, what a zoning code is in general. We'll pass it over to Meg in the city to talk a little bit about the intersection and history of equity and zoning and the kind of land use decisions. We'll do a very brief summary then on kind of some big picture land use and kind of implications of the new zoning code, and then spend the meat of our night tonight discussing environmental protections, which you see there. So really diving in, and please, while we go through this, feel free to use the chat and drop any questions in there. We're all monitoring that, and we'll make sure that we address those questions as we move along here. So realizing that we all kind of have maybe a varying understanding of what a zoning code is and kind of what it is not. So just wanted to create a baseline understanding for everybody. Really, the city's zoning code it's the legal foundation that sets the rules for what can be built and can't be built, where things can be built, and then how they're permitted to look as well too. And some of the earliest versions of this, which Meg will get into in much greater detail, date back to the 1900s, and in part were intended to guide the health, safety, and general welfare of a community. So again, kind of how do land use decisions get made, and how can those best protect a community? And it doesn't necessarily guarantee development will happen, which I think is a key point. Of just because a piece of land is kind of zoned or has rules of a certain manner doesn't guarantee that development will happen. But again, it sets those rules for what can and can't happen within that area of land. And we may kind of use the term districts today a little bit, kind of a zoning district. That's kind of what you might think of as like a residential, a commercial, industrial. Those are kind of more commonplace known as districts. And those are by certain areas. And so when you're looking kind of at a triangle of kind of control or regulation rather, zoning code sits pretty far on the bottom. It doesn't necessarily have as specific or direct regulatory impact as something such as like a building permit might have, which is of course when a building is already in process of being developed. So it sits just above the city's comprehensive plan. So this is kind of, broader, looser guidance. Meg uses the term kind of more of a blunt tool rather than a scalpel, so to speak, if that's a familiar term. And so think of this as kind of, what are a little bit bigger picture guidance that the zoning code provides. So great, but what does that mean for Brooklyn Center? And kind of why the new zoning code and all that? I think, taking a huge step back, the current code that exists for the city really hasn't had a significant refresh and update since the 1960s, which is of course a long time, and a lot has happened, especially in terms of land use and building practices and environmental controls, et cetera, since then. So it's really realizing that it needs a full refresh. It has to kind of modernize the code. And to be honest, I think kind of most people within Brooklyn Center really won't see a tremendous amount of impact necessarily to their daily lives. But really, what the code intends to do is allow for more options and clarity in how land can or cannot be used, including especially, I think, for how homes and businesses can and cannot be used, where they can be developed. And then, of course, as we'll talk about today, what are certain environmental protections that come from those. And then with this update, and we'll talk about this more in a second, the city really we're tending to have a more efficient, effective, and flexible process that benefits all people. So why update the code now? Well, one, since it's been since 1960s, as I mentioned, but it aligns with the recent city's comprehensive plan, which is done every 10 years and provides a 20-year guidance and kind of outlook to the history of kind of what Brooklyn Center wishes to be and how it hopes to get there. So with that getting passed and approved a few years back, that provided an extra level of guidance that the zoning code could now lean on. But it also, of course, brings it into compliance with state law, which is a big piece of what we'll be talking about today. It reorganizes the code so it's much clearer and easier to use, as I've previously mentioned, and then really modernizes its regulations. It kind of brings it up to, what is the market and the private sector already doing? What do kind of people want and need from homes that the previous code hasn't allowed that needs to now be allowed? So some of the major changes and implications, we'll address this a little bit more later on, but several new districts that allow a multitude or kind of several different types of uses in either in near proximity or within the same kind of lot. The city is now better equipped to connect housing, jobs, service, and transit, a big equity piece, which Meg will talk about in a second. One thing that I actually I find really exciting is that it actually allows for the creation of neighborhood centers, which again we'll talk about in a second. But actually, small scale neighborhood serving kind of retail or commercial centers that can kind of be sprinkled throughout the city. And then just updating guidance and environmental protection, both with kind of better clarity, but even in adherence to state law. So at this point, I'll turn it over to Meg, who will discuss a little bit in kind of greater detail about the history of zoning and equity.
Thanks, Mike. So this is a presentation we've given at the other two meetings. If you have attended those, I apologize that you have to sit through again. If you haven't, this is an abbreviated version just because we know that we want to get to the environmental protections component of this work this evening. So we've shortened it a bit, so a bit abridged, but the full presentation is available in the link that's in the chat if you're interested in that. So this component really looks at and tries to understand planning's professional role in relationship to systemic racism over time and in our history, and also how zoning itself has contributed to systemic racism. And so this is something we think is really important to understand in terms of context when we're looking at updating a zoning code. To really be intentional about how that's being done, and to also acknowledge and really understand where we've come from. So zoning as a practice and planning as a profession really began around the turn of the century. Communities and cities needed to respond to exploding population growth that was coupled with industrialization. And so cities were addressing congestion and overcrowding and disease in ways that they never had before. And this was really a tall order for cities that were very much ill-equipped to handle these new problems. And so planning as a profession really emerged within that context. One of the first important movements or areas of thought around planning was the reform movement. And this came about around this same time. And the reform movement really desired sprawl and open space as a way to address population density within cities and to separate people. And this really was the start of suburbanization, this idea that we could create places that were between the urban core and our agricultural roots, and that it would be sort of the best of both worlds, right? And it's important to note that the reform movement was mostly white and it was mostly upper middle class. And so, as these thoughts and ideas were being formed about what suburbanization was, that was clearly the lens through which we identified who would benefit from this new planning world. There was two really important Supreme Court cases that early on that defined zoning and how we think about it and use it today. The first was the 1917 Buchanan versus Worley case. And essentially what that case did was it prohibited racialized language in zoning codes. It said that zoning had to be race neutral in the way that it presented itself. At this time, Southern cities were using racialized zoning language to strengthen segregation. And Northern cities were using racialized zoning language to protect and enhance property values. And so that was prohibited. The other important case is the 1926 Euclid case. And the Euclid case really created zoning as we know it today. In fact, zoning codes that use districts are actually called Euclidean zoning because of this planning case. And so what it did was it allowed cities to regulate land through zoning districts. And it allowed them to separate land uses. And in the court decision, they stated that this decision would see that the right sort of buildings are put in the right places and the wrong sort could be excluded from inappropriate places. And so together, these decisions really allowed cities to legally segregate land uses and neighborhoods using race-neutral language, but to achieve racially motivated goals. This led to what we would consider exclusionary zoning, and I'll talk about that a little bit in a bit. And so when we really think about what the original purpose of zoning is and how that has shaped the legacy of our communities, zoning was really originally about conditioning and restricting. It was about balancing values of property rights against the public good. And race and class-based motives were used in early zoning adoption very regularly and explicitly. Shortly after these court cases, President Woodrow Wilson did create a national task force to create a model zoning law that cities could use that would align with the Supreme Court decisions. And he did place prominent segregationists on this committee, who really helped form the basis for zoning and how zoning was addressed in cities. Next slide. By the 1930s, the Homeowners Loan Corporation maps really came into existence. And these were the federal government's answer on how to assess risky versus preferred mortgage investments and lending practices. So keep in mind sort of the time frame, right? It's the 1930s, and the federal government is introducing investment-backed insured mortgages. And so really was the birth of the 30-year mortgage, and really the birth of the middle class and this idea of homeownership as a prominent and predominant wealth building activity for middle class homeowners. But the federal government needed a way to identify where they would provide these backed mortgages and assess, where there were risky loans and where they would not be risky. And these maps were largely based on race and geography. And really, this is what we know of today as redlining, essentially based on the neighborhood and the presence of people of color. Whole areas would be downgraded in terms of their risk. These maps were also used by the Federal Housing Administration and the Veterans Administration to determine mortgage worthiness and where mortgages would be provided. And these were further reinforced through other federal legislation that were part of the New Deal, like the GI Bill, the Federal Housing Act, and then the Highway Act, all of which really compounded and created these patterns of segregation and disinvestment in communities of color that made it very difficult to own homes and to invest. And so what we know is that these patterns have really persisted through to today. We can see the result of segregated communities within our own neighborhoods and our own cities. And these were further reinforced by zoning that separated land uses. And so, one example I will use is looking at the Minneapolis red line map of the 1930s. And you can overlay that on top of Minneapolis' zoning map today and see where those lines match up. Looking at the separation of land uses, single family from multifamily, as a tool to keep people apart, to separate and exclude people of color, and really look at where wealth building activities could occur within a city. Next slide. Another component of this was also racially restrictive deed covenants. So these were enacted by the real estate and financial industries to further restrict where people of color could live and own property. So there's a whole body of work that's dedicated to restrictive deed covenants called Mapping Prejudice. If you're not familiar with that work, you can Google it. It's out of the University of Minnesota, and they've done some absolutely phenomenal research on this. Restrictive covenants really gained ground in 1910 when the first one was introduced in Minneapolis, but they quickly spread and were used really very much in most of Minneapolis and South Minneapolis in particular, as well as first and second ring suburbs as they were developing out, particularly to the south. Here's an example of a Lake of the Isles advertisement for subdivision in South Minneapolis. But you can read for yourself. There was restrictions that were put on the deed that prohibited and made it illegal for a person of color to purchase a home, or for somebody who owned property to sell that property to a person of color. These practices were outlawed in Minnesota in 1953, but remained commonplace through the 1960s and the Fair Housing Act. And these activities really were supplemented by blockbusting and other steering practices by the real estate community to really encourage and continue that separation and segregation. And ultimately what this does is it reinforces unequal access to housing, both housing finance and mortgages, housing in communities that are upwardly mobile or increasing in value, and ultimately cutting off at the knees the ability of families of color to to own homes and to accumulate wealth. And so this really continued the segregation and the patterns that we see today in our own community. Now, granted, these were used across the nation. And I'm just using some examples from Minneapolis and the Twin Cities, but they were very actively used in the Twin Cities. Next slide. The 1960s did bring about the promise of social transformation, some new legal tools that would help challenge segregationist practices, such as the Fair Housing Act and the Civil Rights Act. So what these acts did was they provided laws that prohibited discrimination, but most importantly, they tied these laws to funding that communities would receive. And so it really created a duty to comply, both for communities as well as those practicing within the housing industry. And so for the first time, really, I think had a positive impact on some of those activities and practices. However, as a result of these important pieces of legislation, we saw a significant rise in exclusionary zoning practices, which really became more vital for ex-urban communities as they continued to push to exclude families of color from these communities. And so when we talk about exclusionary zoning, we're really talking about zoning that is driving up the cost of purchasing and owning property. So these are more predominantly seen in ex-urban places, but they're also seen in some inner ring and as well as the city. And so they're really defined by large minimum lot sizes, excessive design standards or setbacks, single family housing primacy that really excludes or prohibits multifamily housing and rental property, zoning that limits and defines the definition of families, and also zoning that that really separates and restricts multifamily housing or other types of housing that might be seen as more affordable, group homes, things of that nature. And so, we really see some progress in terms of some of the actions in the 1960s, but clearly, some setbacks as some of these other second ring and third ring suburbs are developing out. Next slide. So really, what we see is that decades later, housing discrimination still exists today. And there's a consequence for years of exclusionary laws and practices. There are places with limited to no racial or ethnic diversity. And ultimately what has occurred is that renters bear the brunt of housing cost burdens to the benefit of homeowners who've been heavily subsidized by the federal government through tax breaks, insured mortgages, and infrastructure improvements that have helped literally pave the way for homes to be built at more affordable prices, but with infrastructure that's paid for by everyone and our tax dollars. And we also know that our nation is facing a significant housing shortage, which drives up the cost of housing, which is exacerbated by low turnover rates, new construction that's not keeping up with population growth, and overall an extremely high cost of construction. So these are all factors that affect housing prices. We also know that development in regions isn't balanced or equitably dispersed. Different places face different problems and different market pressures. And so we have to recognize that solutions to these problems need to be created within each community's context. There isn't a one-size-fits-all approach when it comes to zoning or land use practices. You really need to understand the market and what's existing within that community. And really through all of this, we see parallel problems have emerged. We have housing affordability and availability is really coupled with displacement and eviction and housing instability. And so the discriminatory effect and impact of exclusionary policies and practices have really played out in a lot of different ways, specifically around housing and housing access. And ultimately, the bottom line is that BIPOC communities have lost generations of equity, which white people have gained due to racially discriminatory practices, as well as private restrictive covenants and deeds. Next slide. So just to pivot quickly, and talk a little bit about Brooklyn Center specifically in its history. Brooklyn Center as a first ring suburb experienced most of its significant growth during the 50s and 60s. And largely this was after many of the programs we discussed were no longer in effect, or the Fair Housing Act and the Civil Rights Act had really altered. Though many families in Brooklyn Center did benefit from the GI Bill, and the GI Bill is widely known to have been very inequitably dispersed in terms of the soldiers that received these benefits were predominantly and almost exclusively white. And so that is one aspect to think about when we think about the history of Brooklyn Center. Historically, though, Brooklyn Center has been relatively affordable. It's been considered a working class suburb or a blue collar suburb. And really, when we look through the zoning, we don't see a lot of exclusionary zoning or sort of typical exclusionary zoning practices that were utilized in Brooklyn Center. We see a small block grid system, relatively small lots, and relatively accessible and affordable homes. Early residents were predominantly, but not exclusively, white. Brooklyn Center does have a bit of a unique history of having more inclusion and diversity in its background than other similarly situated first-ring suburbs. However, I think when we look at the land use patterns and how Brooklyn Center really has built out, we see really sharply separated land uses with predominantly single family neighborhoods that have been organized around a central auto-oriented regional commercial shopping district. And so what this pattern has done is made it difficult for residents to access transit and employment opportunities and commercial areas and services by really any means other than a car. And that isn't atypical of suburban development during this time period. It tended to be very auto-oriented, but ultimately what that separation of land uses does is it really separates people from the places and the centers and services that they would typically want to use and have access to. And so the other thing that I'll just state is that, Brooklyn Center has a history of being very retail and service centered. When we look at our job distribution within the community, we have a high number of retail service jobs. And that's not surprising given the history of Brookdale Mall and all of the surrounding retail, which really was what the city focused on and doubled down on in terms of development patterns. The downside of that is as retail has changed and our nation has really shifted and retail trends have had enormous upheaval over the last 20 years, it really has had a negative effect on Brooklyn Center. And so when we look at industrial land and land that has more of a tax base and job producing function compared with other communities, we see that industrial land has really maintained its value, whereas a lot of retail, particularly aging retail, has not. And so not only does that have an effect on the jobs that are available within the community and the quality of those jobs, but it also affects really the resiliency of the community over time to have that stable tax base. Next slide. So Mike alluded to this a bit earlier, but the 2040 Comprehensive Plan really laid out a future land use plan that pivoted from past development patterns. So historically, transit has been pushed away from the most significant destinations and really disconnected it from where people lived and the places they wanted to go. And what the 2040 Comprehensive Plan did was it created new mixed use districts for the first time in the city's history, really focusing those areas on areas that were likely to redevelop or were under invested in. It embraced transit and identified ways, it identified transit as an asset, and in fact, an organizing feature around which land use could be situated. It focused higher density housing on or near transit corridors, and it introduced mixed use commercial nodes that were within or adjacent to established single family neighborhoods, which really creates the goal of a more walkable environment that places neighborhoods serving commercial activities nearer to where people live. And as Mike said, the city's current zoning code was last codified in the early 1960s, and so it doesn't align with the new vision for the community that was identified in the 2040 Comprehensive Plan. The code today the zoning code is really not particularly user friendly. It's out of compliance with state law in some cases, with the city's comp plan in many cases. And it's hard to interpret. It's hard to interpret for staff, let alone for residents and more casual users of the code. There's a lot of gray areas. And ultimately, at the end of the day, what our code does is it reinforces old land use patterns. One of the things that I really subscribe to is this idea that we should zone for what we want, make it easy to do the right thing, as a way to kind of clear the path for the types of development that we want. And that ultimately is how you help funnel investment in the direction that you want it to go. Next slide. So all of this work around the zoning code really is being done through an equity lens. And it's really about being intentional about reducing racial disparities and improving outcomes for underserved communities within Brooklyn Center. And so part of that is about enacting the vision of the 2040 plan and elevating mixed use districts, higher density residential development in places where it can be served by transit and services. It's also about thinking about ways to increase the supply of housing in general, because we know that there's a shortage and that drives up the cost of housing, and make homeownership more affordable. We also are looking at ways to provide zoning flexibility in exchange for things that we know we want, like sustainable development and housing affordability and affordable commercial spaces. And so looking at ways to inject that into the code. Looking to consider how we accommodate multi-generational housing needs, how we provide allowances for home-based businesses, looking at urban agriculture as a way to, to allow it and promote it within the zoning code. So these are some of the ways that we're doing that work. So at this point, I'm going to turn it back over to Mike, and we can kind of dig into the environmental component of this code update.
Excellent. Appreciate it, Megan. Thank you, as always, for kind of giving what we really feel is a pretty important and foundational understanding to kind of what is grounding and guiding a lot of this process, is that understanding of equity and promoting that through the zoning code. So for those who have been in our last two meetings, you're going to have already seen these next couple slides. I just, for this one, I wanted to provide a really kind of brief overview of some of the highlights of the new zoning code. If you want to take a deeper dive, the website I've mentioned a few times has the past recorded sessions. There's also more resources on that website too, in addition to some further upcoming kind of outreach and education stuff that we'll be doing. So really quickly, and again, I apologize in advance that I'm going to move through this at a pretty quick pace. This is the existing districts that the current zoning code has. And for the new code, it's actually been pretty drastically consolidated into the ones that you see there on the right. And so reducing a lot of redundancies, providing greater clarity, and a realization that though all those old kind of districts it was unnecessary and at times became very burdensome to manage. So with those districts, which now are listed there on the left, it's the same as the box that was just on the last slide. Why create these and why go through this process? Again, reflecting updated guidance from the comp plan, modernizing the code, promoting clarity and efficiency in terms of land use, zoning, and the development process. But ultimately, again, as kind of Meg was alluding to already, supporting goals around equity, sustainability, affordability, and access to amenities for all people within the code. So this is the kind of the draft zoning map. This is kind of the unofficial official map that shows every property in the city and what kind of the future zoning will be of it as this process eventually gets kind of finalized. So again, I apologize, I'm going to go through this pretty quickly. All of these are up on that project website, so you can spend as much time as you want looking at these further. Couple highlights though. The first, as I mentioned earlier, those neighborhood-based centers. This code envisions that large portions of Brooklyn Boulevard actually kind of become those more neighborhood-oriented and kind of a little bit denser centers with both multifamily and some kind of single-family oriented commercial. Think of your coffee shop or kind of a small pop-in restaurant, things of that nature near single-family homes. Along where the opportunity site, if you've heard of that, kind of the old Brookdale Mall, and along Shingle Creek Crossing, there's something called transit-oriented development, which is among the higher density transit supportive uses that are a mix of uses of both residential and commercial, with clear access to things such as walkability, bikeability, and transit access. Those are envisions for those those teal areas that you see there. The other kind of highlight then too is just up above the 94-694 interstate. That whole kind of purplish area is something that we're calling business mixed use, which is a bit of a hybrid between some light industrial, commercial, and then some supportive retail. So we've been describing essentially, if you've got a coffee roaster, if Hyla and Meg collectively own a coffee roaster and you're roasting in the back, but you want to have a store maybe in the front where people can pop in, buy some coffee, have a little kind of coffee bar, that zoning would allow you to do something of that nature, should you want to. So it kind of blends these uses together while allowing a lot of really what's already up there as well today. The last one then at 69th and Humboldt is again that neighborhood-based center, that neighborhood mixed use neighborhood and mixed use residential. Again, thinking of that as kind of a neighborhood center up on that northeast corner of the city. So again, I apologize for kind of the quick overview of that. Again, up on that website, which I'll put the link in a little bit, has the more deeper dive on all those elements. So the meat of tonight, and we'll spend the next little bit of time here overviewing some environmental protections within the new code, and two of them in particular, which I'll highlight on the next slide, but really I'm looking at as the code as a vehicle to, again, promote equity and even sustainability and environmental protections. How does the new code address these? It's a couple, it provides development regulations for uses, especially around bodies of water, which is what we'll talk about much of today. Again, what can be built near bodies of water, what can it look like, and then where can it be built, both in relation to the body of water, but even within the property itself. Guidance and permits, and kind of clarity around the requirements around any sort of vegetation or land removals or alterations. It doesn't necessarily say you can't do those things, but provides a little bit better guidance around, should you do those things, what permits may or may not be required. And again, we'll get into this more in the next couple slides. And ultimately, it brings the city into compliance with state regulations too, which is something that has been needed. So the two that we're going to focus on today, the two elements of water body and environmental protections we're going to focus on today is the shoreland ordinance. And then as Dan mentioned earlier, what's shorthanded to MRCA, or the Mississippi River Critical Area, Mississippi River Critical Corridor Area, Corridor Critical Area. So MRCA, rather than having to say that mouthful each time, we'll just shorthand it to MRCA. So briefly, shoreland, it creates development provisions around bodies of water, so the lakes and the Mississippi River, and then provides regulatory tools and protections around those. And again, you can kind of read in more detail here. I'm giving the highlight and overview as we work through this. Regulations are managed by the DNR, which is again why we're glad that Dan, our expert, is here with us today. And as you'll see in a moment too, the specific regulations are based on the type of water body, both lake versus river, and then even within lakes, the type of lake that the DNR has designated those lakes. Brooklyn Center has 4 lakes, of course, and then also the Mississippi River has those requirements on them as well. And then the city, because this is a state mandated requirement and process, the city actually has pretty limited capacity in the level of the adjustments or kind of how far it can kind of push some of this guidance as well too. With MRCA then, Shoreland is a statewide program, whereas MRCA is more along the Mississippi River, the 71-mile stretch of the Mississippi River, especially centered around the Twin Cities area. Again, provides development standards and criteria with the goal of protecting water quality and natural habitats. Also created and managed by the DNR. And there's actually 25 cities and townships that fall within kind of the MRCA footprint, so to speak. Each of them are required then to pass a MRCA ordinance as well. So this isn't just a Brooklyn Center only thing. It's kind of everyone within that 71-mile stretch is required to. And again, similar to Shoreland, kind of limited capacity and the ability to adjust some of those requirements. So a term I want to just throw out real quick, and I'm going to do my best not to make this overly technical because it's pretty easy to get in the weeds, no pun intended, pretty quickly. There's a term that we'll use a couple times that I think does bear some impact on regulations, a term called the ordinary high water level. And Dan, feel free to correct me if I stray too far from the actual definition, but it's essentially, as you see there in the second paragraph, it's kind of the highest water level that is regularly or kind of is maintained for what kind of is defined as a sufficient amount of time. So really, regularly speaking, where's about the highest water level that a body of water will have. And based on that, that's where a lot of setbacks and heights and other things are kind of based off of too. So again, we're not going to get into too much of the measurements of that, this property, that property, but just wanted to flag that initially of we'll use the term ordinary high water level a decent amount throughout here, and that's kind of what that term refers to. And the DNR has a tremendous amount more of resources around this too, should you want to learn more. So of the two, again, we've got shoreland and MERCA. We'll look at shoreland first and give kind of an overview for each of the water bodies shown there. Kind of some of the impacts. Again, it expands what can be built and where it can be built, and some flexibility as well too. I shouldn't say expand, but provides better regulation and guidance around that rather. So we've got this cheat sheet, which we're going to kind of spend some time with and dissect a little bit. Don't worry about memorizing it quite yet. We'll kind of work through each of these columns. And this is, again, all up on that project website. So we'll go through this, but there's those are available at your kind of your convenience to look at further. And if you remember, I mentioned, the 4 water bodies within Brooklyn Center. Each of them has, its own kind of guidance and regulation based on its classification, that top row there. So starting with the upper twin and middle twin lakes, those are what's kind of determined as general developments. That's their classification, which then brings the below guidance that you see there too. So structure heights is allowed within that purple footprint, this is the case for all of the subsequent slides with the bodies of water. That kind of that purple shaded area is the shoreland, kind of that district or footprint. So any residential districts in that area, a 25-foot structure height, and that exempts churches. And then there's for non-residential uses, then that height is removed, that height restriction is removed. You see some stuff there. Again, I'm not going to get into all of this, but then kind of some guidance on how you measure that based on which surrounding features. So for properties then that are immediately along the body of water, there's actually then that 50-foot setback from that body of water, using that high water level that I mentioned earlier too. And then with bluffs, because there isn't determined to be bluffs kind of along the lake water bodies, there actually isn't then any setback requirement from bluffs. You can see then the allowable uses, both what are permitted, so basically kind of by right, you can pursue certain uses, and then conditional, which require a little bit different kind of permitting or variances potentially. You can kind of see what's allowed for both of these 2 lakes. And then again, for many of the properties, especially those that are immediately along the body of water, along 2 lakes, for the lowest allowable floor elevation, again, kind of your basement or whatever your lowest floor is, kind of where can that be in elevation? 3 foot above that ordinary high water level mark, and there'll be a graphic on that in a second. And then with land or vegetation alterations, again, I mentioned that earlier too. You can see some of the guidance that provided there, but kind of rather than reading it all, what Shoreland and MERCA does, it provides a little bit of guidance of if you meet certain thresholds in certain areas, it requires certain permits and DNR approval, both city and DNR approval, to make kind of those alterations to either land and or vegetation, which you see there. And then for finally with impervious coverage, essentially what is kind of land coverage or kind of built material that doesn't necessarily allow water to go through. So think of driveways, your house, a patio, things of that nature. The shoreland ordinance for all bodies of water allows just a 25% coverage of impervious coverage. So think of your house and your driveway, any similar features, a maximum of 25% of the lot that can cover. If that makes sense. Shifting then over to Palmer Lake, and again, feel free to use the chat for questions, and we'll try to save most of tonight for that Q&A portion as well too. For Palmer Lake, then that's classified as a natural environment. And so there's a little bit actually stricter requirements for many pieces. Again, you can see the heights, the height allowances and kind of process for that. If you remember on the past or on the previous slide, excuse me, for upper middle twin, it was a 50-foot setback for parcels that are on the body of water. Because of the designation, this has been upped actually to 150. Again, with bluffs, no setback, you can see the allowable uses there, both permitted and conditional, which are fairly similar to the previous two lakes, with a little bit more restrictions along the permit to just single family rather than upper and middle, which have duplex, triplex, and quadplex as well too, which is just permitted. It doesn't necessarily mean that the zoning code would allow, but it would be permitted. And then similar for the floor elevation alterations and impervious coverage as well too. Finally, then for Ryan Lake, which is the fourth and final, been designated as a recreational development. And then you can see the subsequent allowances here. Height measuring are the same process for all bodies of water, of course. The setback has actually been then kind of reduced a little bit to 75 feet, based again on that classification. From bluffs, then there's no setback requirements. And then for permitted and conditional uses, you see those there, which listed there, which are actually the same as upper and middle twin. So recreational development and then general development classifications from the first initial two are actually the same allowable land uses. And then you can also, of course, see the same for floor elevation, vegetation and alterations, and then impervious coverages are all the same as well too. Finally, and actually we're gonna pivot then from shoreland over to MRCA. Shoreland does provide some Mississippi River guidance. It's fairly comparable in many ways to what we just mentioned. However, and this is where things get a little tricky, which we'll note more in a second, the Mississippi River in a lot of metro communities, and especially Brooklyn Center, gets a little bit tricky because it falls within both shoreland and MRCA. And so I've listed here, since this one's a little bit more complex, we've just listed here the MRCA guidance, but just know that there is some shoreline considerations. It might be a little tricky to see, but on the far right side of the city, before you hit the body of water, there's that purple shaded section within the yellow and orange. That is the shoreland, but then yellow and orange is the two sections in particular that we have highlighted in this table. So again, I'll apologize, it gets multiple layers to this, and this is where things can get a little tricky. But we've outlined here the orange section, which is the furthest west from the river, is determined as the separated from river district. Again, these are all DNR designated kind of designations, and this map is again up on the website too. And then the yellow is the separated from river, which is, the opposite then of what I said, I'm sorry. The river neighborhood district is the yellow, and then the orange is the separated from river. So kind of flip what I just mentioned. So river neighborhood is most immediately on the shore. And so because of that reason, there's actually a little bit more restrictions for the river neighborhood versus separated from river, which is basically the yellow versus orange. So yellow has more restrictions, which you can see there of a structure. Allowable heights is 35 feet for anywhere in that yellow. The height measuring process is listed there. Setbacks from the body of water. So if you own a property anywhere within that yellow area, it has to be at least 100 feet back from the Mississippi River. And then any bluffs along the river, which we've got highlighted a little bit, and there's some more maps on the DNR website. Should you be next to any bluffs, that's a 40-foot setback required from that bluff. You can see then the allowable uses, both permitted and conditional, fairly similar, actually the same as the Ryan Lake we just mentioned. And then as well, the similar guidance for allowable, lowest allowable floor. And then for alterations to vegetation and land, there is actually permits required for that, both for DNR permits. And then allowable impervious coverage, actually it defers to the underlying zoning. So what the zoning code actually says is kind of the guidance provided there. And again, that's just for MRCA. For shoreland, where there's kind of that crossover, it defers to whichever is the two more restrictive of the two, if that makes sense. Finally, then for separated from river, which is the orange, the one that's furthest away from the river, a little bit more flexible, again, because it's not necessarily on the body of water itself. So allowable structure height, it defers to the underlying zoning. You see the height measurement process there. There's no setbacks from the water because none of it touches the water. So it's kind of hard to have a setback for something you're not touching. Bluffs as well, 40 feet, should there be any bluffs, which there's just a couple, but nothing too intensive. And then you see the allowable uses, lowest allowable floor, and alterations and impervious coverage, which is the same as the yellow, the river neighborhood. So that is the kind of the quick and dirty overview of both some specific kind of guidance that is provided by both the Shoreland and MERCA, as you see here. And again, all of these are on the website, as I've said multiple times too. So one thing I wanted to note within MERCA is there's a kind of an additional layer of consideration called primary conservation areas. And I'm not going to get into any of them in any great detail. I just wanted to make sure that we highlight them here as, there's the guidance that provided by within MERCA and the regulations rather provided here. But for certain areas within the MERCA district, there may be additional kind of physical features that warrant additional kind of regulations and conservation efforts as well too. So this is up on the DNR website, and we'll be providing a link to this later up on our project website. But I just wanted to note that there are certain zones that again may warrant that additional cover or regulation. The map on the right is the public-facing map that the DNR provides, on which you can kind of look around, zoom in and out, and find your property, et cetera. And really, I'll kind of note, if you can see my cursor, really there are very few between the river and this kind of reddish orange line. It's really these kind of yellow squiggles and then these bluish areas that designate areas that may have some more protection. So the bluff impact zone, and then I'm going to assume it's the wetlands as well too, these kind of bluish ones. And again, it's a little tough to see at this scale. So again, what you can do then is you simply click on the bluff impact zones. It tells you a little bit more of some of the guidance, and same with the wetlands as well too. So each of these expand and you can learn more. Just wanted to highlight that should you have property kind of along these yellow squiggles or near any of this wetland, there may be some additional guidance above and beyond what was just mentioned. Finally, then, it kind of as we're rounding the end of this kind of high-level summary, there's a couple of different additional considerations too with properties, especially those near bodies of water. And I maybe should have mentioned at the outset, some of the guidance that was previously mentioned in that table does in fact apply, of course, to any property within those those purple districts, which I'll go back to that map in a second. But the most guidance and regulations rather, the most regulations apply only to the properties that are on those bodies of water, such as the setbacks and things of that nature. So a couple additional considerations then too, we just wanted to highlight briefly. For setbacks, again, there is both for MERCA and Shoreland, there is the setback guidance and regulations that we mentioned. However, in cases when there's an adjacent structure on either side, so again, if let's say Hyla owns a lake house and Meg and I live on either side of her, there can be, rather than necessarily doing the setback regulation that's provided, there's some averaging that you can do based on the two adjacent properties of kind of taking their average setbacks and using that as your kind of regulatory measure, so to speak. So without going into all the math around that too, you just wanted to highlight that there might be opportunities should you have adjacent structures. With decks, and again, I'm definitely not going to try to dissect all of this, but just wanted to note that for pre-existing structures, they can kind of further encroach or be expanded a little bit, and the certain measurements are there in the middle, into the setback kind of zone, again, for pre-existing structures as well too. So there's a little bit of flexibility within that. And then the lowest floor elevation, which I've mentioned a couple times too, and typically you'd see that maybe on a first floor or even a basement. And again, this is immediately adjacent a body of water. Those have to be no lower than 3 feet above that ordinary high water level. So again, your basement can't be 3 feet, more than 3 feet from that mark. So then kind of turning, I mean, this is a lot, right? Like it's a lot to figure out and manage. I'm sure Dan gets way more questions than, of course, we covered here today. So there is a kind of recognizing that too. We just wanted to highlight, should you own property kind of within these districts, and especially on a body of water, what's kind of just a high level process that can be pursued and kind of explored if you're thinking of doing, say, either from a whole home rebuild or just expanding your deck, or you want to kind of clear out an area of vegetation, have a better view of the water, something of that nature. First off, and we'll be posting these on and publishing them on the project website soon for kind of public comment and review, but reviewing the ordinances themselves, again, whether it's shoreland, MERCA, and some of the others too, and trying and working to familiarize with what is the language, what does it allow, what might it not allow. Most importantly though, and I would recommend, and I'll apologize in advance, Jenny, because navigating this at times can be tricky, but meeting with city staff and inquiring with city staff, reviewing plans that you may have, and then identifying too with any of this, there's opportunities for variances or as well, or kind of exemptions to a degree for some of these regulations. And then should you want any kind of, or be pursuing any conditional uses, reviewing those opportunities as well, and kind of seeing what may or may not be allowable and appropriate. And then finally applying for the necessary permit. So reviewing the ordinances, meeting with staff, and then actually applying for those permits. And that ensures zoning code compliance, but as well any mitigation plans that may be needed. So if there is a variance involved, oftentimes that will require a mitigation plan of some measure to help offset some of the actions being taken, and that'll help kind of navigate that process too. And Dan can correct me if I'm off on this too far in the Q&A, but for much, if not all of these, this will also require, many of these will require DNR kind of approval and permits submitted to the DNR too. So it's not just Meg and Jenny who are the authorities on this too. The state has a role as well. With that then, that was a lot and in a pretty quick time, but again, we wanted to save quite a bit of space here for Q&A to cover this. So I am going to pull up the chat here, which I see, and then I'm going to kind of invite Dan and others to chime in. I'm going to go back on our slideshow to the map as we read. Excuse me. I'm going to go back to the map, so excuse me as I go through this kind of quickly. And then we will do the Q&A. So again, appreciate everyone for your time and kind of hanging in there. It's been quite a bit already. But I think this is some good stuff, and I'm excited about kind of working through this a little bit more. So, oh, and Hyla did post the link up in the chat box as well too, to the project website, which we'll highlight a little bit more towards the end too. So, all right, and again, feel free to keep using the chat and all of that. So,
Mike, this is Dan.
Yeah, go for it, Dan.
I just wanted to say that was a very comprehensive presentation. You covered a lot of territory there. Good job. One thing I did want to note, though, is that the DNR doesn't have any permitting authority for any of these programs. It's a state regulation. Our role is to work with local governments to make sure that they have the correct language in their zoning ordinance, and then the local government is the administrator of the regulations at that point. So the only time the DNR is involved with regulating would be if somebody wanted to do work in the water body itself, below the ordinary high. Then there are a set of public water regulations governing work in a body of water, and that's where the DNR permit comes in.
Excellent, and that's exactly why we have you here, Dan, so thank you.
Okay.
Appreciate it. So this first question then for the RN, I'm going to go forward to the MERCA. Actually, I'll just kind of leave it on this one. Does the 100-foot setback refer to new construction or existing houses already within that 100-foot? This would just be for new structures. So in a sense, kind of existing structures are essentially kind of grandfathered into a degree for some of this guidance. And then the setback from the bluffs, 40 foot, is larger than the old Brooklyn Center code. I'm just correct. And again, this is kind of bringing the updated guidance with kind of DNR regulations and bringing the city code into compliance with that. And then third, the vegetation permit needs some explanation. If a tree is falling into the river, can we remove it without a permit?
Yes.
Perfect, easy enough. And there
Yeah.
is within the zoning code, I should say, too, some kind of qualifiers for certain types of vegetation, such as dead trees, things that have fallen into the river or body of water as well. So
Right. So just to recap on that, the setback standards apply to new construction. There are the rules, the critical area or MRCA rules do allow existing structures that don't meet setbacks to expand laterally without a variance. So that was built into the rules primarily due to homeowners in the North Metro, like Brooklyn Center, who have a lot of existing homes that don't meet these setbacks. People want the ability to expand, and so we wrote into the rules the ability to expand laterally, as long as it doesn't encroach further towards the river or a bluff. So that's a possibility for people who want some flexibility there. So yes, that's that.
excellent. Kind of a question too with MRCA in general and some kind of the DNR responsibilities. Talking about infestation plants such as buckthorn and others, and the responsibility that DNR might have for some clearance of those, and similar with kind of certain what are kind of described here as kind of dumping grounds or dumping sediment on different locations as well too, and kind of Dan, any kind of insight you have into DNR responsibility of kind of water quality and cleanup work?
I have to say I don't know much, if anything, about that sort of work. We have a lot of silos in our organization, a lot of different areas of responsibility. So I have to plead ignorance on that. I'm sorry. But if there's dredging in the river, that's something the DNR would permit or work with the Army Corps to permit that sort of activity. But in terms of cleaning up invasives on the islands, I'm not sure whose responsibility that is.
And could you jump to maybe the most recent question here and just clarify and articulate the DNR's responsibility to maintain the shoreline or things below the shoreline, and kind of, where does the DNR's responsibility begin and end, and where does the city's begin and end?
That is the ordinary high water level. So any work below that would be a DNR permit or approval. And the most common thing that would probably matter to the people on this call would be wanting to do some sort of riprap. If you feel like you have some sort of erosion going on in your shoreline, you would hopefully just work with riprap above the ordinary high. But if it happened to go below, for some reason you needed to go below the water for structural integrity, then the DNR would have to be involved to review that. And the critical area regulations would require the city to verify that the DNR has approved any work below before the city would permit any work above the ordinary high. Does that help?
Yeah, absolutely. Appreciate that, Dan. Thank you. Got another curveball here question for you a little bit, Dan, that I'm guessing is kind of outside the purview, but any kind of insight you have into regulation of kind of boaters, and especially in terms of like wakes and things of that nature on Mississippi River is mentioned in the comment, but I think kind of in general, and considerations for erosion or things of that nature.
Sure. Now, local governments do have the ability to regulate use on the water, like boating, boat speeds, no wake zones. And there is a process under statute where local governments can adopt those sort of regulations. I know that is a concern on lakes all over the place and on the Mississippi River, where you have a sort of a pool. Especially with boats getting bigger and bigger horsepower in these wake boats. They do cause a lot of damage to shorelines, erosion. And so some local governments are looking at ways to regulate the size and speed of these types of boats. But that's a separate process. The DNR doesn't have any regulations that are required, but statute gives local governments the authority to take on that responsibility if they want. On a course like the Mississippi River, you'd probably want to work with adjacent communities, both north and south, as well as across the river, so that everybody's working off the same page and regulating in the same way, because boaters don't really see boundaries between jurisdictions, especially on a body of water. So it's important to have some consistency there.
Right.
Dan, I have a follow-up question about that. If a city or group of cities did adopt regulations that did that, who would be the responsible party in terms of enforcement of them?
It's usually the sheriff. Now, you're between Anoka County and Hennepin County, and so that would create some issues there in terms of enforcement, but it's usually the sheriff that does this sort of thing. That would be probably part of any sort of coordinating agreement and regulations that are set up to have some sort of approach to enforcement, equitable approach between the two counties.
Question actually then, kind of both Colleen and Dan, just kind of curious, you all have been working with ordinances of this nature for some time. Wonder if kind of you have any recommendations or insights for property owners of either commercial or residential for wanting to make regular iterations or changes to their property. Kind of how have you seen that process going well, or what recommendations would you have for someone who wants to navigate this process?
Colleen, go ahead.
Sure. I would say that if you're in doubt as a property owner about what is or is not permitted, or where you might need a permit, talk to your city first. Call the planning and zoning department early. It is much easier to get a quick answer to a question than to run into a problem partway through your project. I think this is especially important for do-it-yourselfers. Not all contractors know the rules, and they especially might not be familiar with things that are limited to pretty small areas like a MERCO ordinance or shoreland ordinance, but they're more likely to know how to follow these processes. If you're thinking about doing something on your own, call the city first. It'll save you a lot of pain later.
Mike, there's a question here about the yellow squiggles along the Mississippi River shore. I don't know if that question is self-explanatory. It popped up, I think, around the time you were talking about the special conservation critical. Yeah. So not sure if Brett, maybe you can clarify.
So,
that's not the map you were referring to with
Yep.
your question.
That was my question, and you're on the slide right now there. This is Brett. So along the shoreline there, it looks like there's two sets of the yellow squiggles kind of up and down that shoreline. Yep, right there, and then north of that too. What is the difference, or what's that about?
Yeah, and so this is from the kind of the DNR public website that allows you to kind of explore and move around to see where are these different conservation areas located. Those are two sets of that have been designated as bluff impact zones. So that would be kind of if you're within certain parameters from those two lines, and again, those have been designated as bluffs. That would require then potentially some additional either setbacks or kind of considerations for that. So. That is what those two squiggle lines are on that map.
So it looks like in both of those areas, it's actually on both sides of the freeway. So I'm looking at the west side of the freeway, for example. That's considered a bluff impact zone. Is that correct?
Mike, if I may, Brett, these are mapped as bluff impact zones, but there was some limitations on technology when these things were mapped. And so our software only identifies criteria that we give it. But the rules only apply to natural or altered natural bluffs, not man-made bluffs such as freeway ramps, access ramps. Embankments
to build a little
up
strange.
Yeah. So yeah. The city is only supposed to sort of address the natural or altered natural, which in I think this city's case almost exclusively fall along the riverbank. I haven't looked at this super carefully, so I couldn't say that for sure, but I think that's sort of what it's looking like here. So you do not need to apply the bluff regulations to any man-made bluff feature.
Got it. Sorry about the crypticness of that question. I use the term squiggly lines, so.
Well, good. I was wondering what that was too. So
I knew what
glad
you
we
meant,
got
Brett.
that
I
figured
was
out.
kind of hoping that would get to the right spot.
Because that's what I would have called them too. Dan, could you speak to this most recent question about the water level in the river? Obviously, we know that we're experiencing significant drought in Minnesota. Water levels are low throughout the state. Can you speak to kind of what considerations or thoughts or a process that the DNR or the Army Corps would utilize when thinking about how drought might impact the dams?
Yeah, that's again, that's something that's a lot of my wheelhouse. I know that the water levels are regulated for a variety of purposes, and I don't know what all of those might be. So I'm sorry that that's not something that I can really speak to with any knowledge.
Is it true that the Army Corps operates the dams?
I'm not even sure about that above Minneapolis.
Okay.
If they do, I know at Minneapolis and below they do, but above that, the head of navigation, I'm not sure they do. So
I actually just looked this up because it was such a good question, and the Three Rivers Park District is responsible for the Coon Rapids Dam.
okay.
The Army Corps does own the Mississippi River Dam starting in Minneapolis at Upper St. Anthony Falls and downstream from there. I think the Army Corps also owns some of the dams up in the headwaters area, but they do not own the Coon Rapids Dam.
Thanks, Colleen.
This is a really interesting question, Ann. Thank you.
I'm not even sure kind of if this is a Dan or Meg question for those looking at the chat talking about, erosion and property loss and any impacts that may have on taxes. I can also say I haven't thought about that one yet. So either Meg or Dan, I don't know if either of you might have insight into that in any way.
I'll pause to see if Dan has a ready-made answer. Otherwise, I have a answer. I don't know if it's a good one.
I don't have any insight to offer, although that if one did have such significant erosion that they lost a lot of their property, I would imagine that there might be some adjustment for that. It would probably have to be a significant loss, though.
Yeah, Dan, thanks. I was thinking along the same line. So, property taxes are based on a couple different factors, right? Your actual property tax bill is based on the assessed value of your property, as well as the tax rate that is applied to that property by the various taxing jurisdictions. So when you're thinking about how property taxes might be impacted by something that affects your land, that generally is going to be tied to that valuation of that land. And so, there's essentially, an appeal of an assessment that would need to take place by the property owner when that assessment is done annually. There's an opportunity to appeal and basically make an argument that your property isn't worth what the Hennepin County Assessor's Office has decided, that it's worth. So I think that would probably be the mechanism through which you would deal with that issue.
So it looks like, just to go back up a bit here, Stacy was asking a question about building a natural earth boat ramp from her yard into the river. And the critical area rules do allow private water access ramps. There are just a couple provisions there, but this is one of those regulations where you're dealing with work in the water. And so you would definitely need to work with like a DNR area hydrologist who works with these public water rules to make sure that you're following the standards in place for a boat ramp.
I've got a follow-up question too. So
Sure.
the presentation has been relatively informational for most part. I'm wondering where in the process can we have additional input as to kind of what develops as far as I see that it's a draft map right now. It sounds like it's still the city's still managing that and trying to figure out what it exactly looks like. Where and how and what points do we have additional input as citizens?
Mike, do you want to talk a little bit about, I'm wondering if Mike I just thought he was holding very still, but I actually think he's frozen.
His Zoom is frozen.
Okay.
I was gonna say, and he has, I don't know if he can advance the slides either because they're on his computer, but there is a slide in this presentation. Maybe I can find it. That I should have it pulled up already. That speaks to that. This is the round, this current round, end of round of meetings is, I don't know if I can boot him from this, end of these 3 meetings, but we do have a formal review process that starts after this. I do not think that there's any date set yet. Correct me if I'm wrong, Meg, regarding the review process, but we can keep the people who are part of this informed as to when those reviews are going to happen. They'll be more through the formal planning commission approval process. Oh, what's going on here?
Yeah, I would think, but I think to answer your question, it kind of depends on what aspects of the code. So obviously this is part of a larger zoning code update that the city is, has underway. And that, deals with really all aspects. The most important aspects in my mind that's related to the zoning code really is about getting our code cleaned up, getting it aligned with state law, getting our processes in place that make sense, getting a land use table that is legible, so that our staff can actually be, helpful to people and businesses that are trying to move and build it in the city. So, that's kind of primary focus number one. And then there's all of these other considerations and aspects and inputs that will be part of this process. And in reality, there is no perfect zoning code. We'll never get to the point where the code is exactly the way we want it. Zoning codes ought to be living, breathing documents. Ours, unfortunately, has not been updated for a very long time. It's been my top priority since I came to the city about 3 years ago to get that done, because I do think it's critical. But I also recognize that it also evolves, right? So if we can get a code that's like 75% of the way there, we can get that adopted and start moving in the right direction, and then we can continue to work on these issues and other things. So I see this as an iterative process that will continue. The other beauty thing about zoning is it happens really slow. It's not like you adopt zoning and then the next day, there's sort of a rush on building permits. Usually, if things aren't going exactly the way you want, it happens slow enough where you can make those adjustments over time as you need to, and ought to be. The cities really ought to be doing that. That is something that should happen. And then in terms of input to this process, we've been gathering that. We've had some surveys out. There'll be a comment period that will open up and ideally, allow plenty of time for folks to kind of look through the sections they're interested in and provide comments back. And we'll continue to do that work. In terms of the shoreline and the MERCA pieces, it's honestly a little bit more limited. These are regulations that have been adopted by the state, and really cities have been obligated to update their codes and adopt these. And so there is sort of a minimum standards that is required. But within that, I think there's conversation about, how things might be implemented, different kinds of regulations, areas that can be more restrictive than state code if we feel like that's something we want to do. And even from this meeting, I'm hearing comments about the speeds of boats in the river. I've seen several comments about that. And that's not something that we've considered as part of this zoning code update, but clearly is probably something that we want to spend some time looking at and probably talking with some of our neighboring cities about as well. So I feel like that's good input. So I don't know if that's, probably not a cut and dry, clear answer to your question, but, there'll be opportunities to provide input on both these particular sections of the code, but also our entire code over, I would say, over the next 4 months.
Thank you. Super helpful.
Thanks. I was gonna say, it looks like there's a question or it's maybe another question we haven't gotten to yet in the chat, or a couple. Let's see. I do have a neighbor whose property lot depth has changed by 20 feet since the 60s. It seems like a big change. Would that warrant a property valuation change?
I think honestly, that's probably a question for the Hennepin County Assessor's Office. So they do valuations annually. You'll get those notices in the usually towards the beginning of the year, and then there's an opportunity to appeal the valuation. And then you formally submit that appeal in writing or attending the appeals board meeting, which the city holds. And then the assessor will follow up with you independently and work through a revised valuation. So that's how that process works, and would be, where to go from there, and then they make that determination in cooperation or in partnership with the property owner.
Someone talking? There's a comment here about the water level being really low. Not really a question. Are there additional questions that hadn't been addressed? I know we had kind of a long chain there. Comments. Anyone feel like their question was not addressed earlier? Additional ones at this point?
Make a quick plug to encourage residents to stay involved in this process. One of the things that's interesting about the MERCA ordinance in particular is that there is a DNR baseline standard, and 25 cities and townships are in the process of adopting this ordinance. So the DNR standard is really good. It is not entirely one size fits all for every community. And so I would encourage you as residents to think about, what do you value in Brooklyn Center's section of the river? What makes it unique? What might be special and worth protecting? And share those ideas with the team here working on your update. For instance, I was in Fridley last week talking about their MERCA ordinance, and Fridley has the Minneapolis and St. Paul drinking water supply intakes that supply over 1 million people in the Twin Cities. So they were thinking about, is there anything we want to do as a city to try to enhance the cleanliness of that water, maybe with vegetation along the shoreline? A couple weeks ago, Mendota Heights was working on theirs, and they have really fragile bluffs and springs, and they were thinking about how do you protect those springs and protect the land from bluff-related erosion. So I think there's a lot of opportunity for cities to make those changes so that this ordinance, despite originating with the DNR, feels like something that really works for Brooklyn Center. And so I would just encourage you to stay connected to that process.
And just a follow-up on that, there's probably 2 communities have fully adopted their ordinance right now, I believe, and there's 4 or 5 more that are almost there, fully adopting it. And almost all those communities have adopted generally most of the higher standards that are optional in the model ordinance. For some of you, that might be jargon, but there are state rules that are minimum standards and criteria. And then within the model ordinance, we wrote in some additional standards that might help clarify administration or provide a higher level of protection to, say, vegetation or bluffs. And in most cases, cities are going ahead and adopting those optional higher standards. So just putting in a plug for that as well. And I think that your ordinance that you shared with me yesterday last week, it includes all of those, but I think you have them highlighted, I think, for further discussion, Mike. So.
Let's say Mike just dropped a link into the standards, and I think they're also, if I'm correct, they're linked to our the project website as well. So if you go to this website, you should be able to navigate there as well. a lot of good resources. And I appreciate the DNR and things that have done in terms of not just the base ordinance, but some frequently asked questions and illustrations and other information for people who want to learn more. There's quite a lot there to go from.
So I've got another follow-up question, probably best for Dan, is my guess. This is Brett again. As you come up river from Minneapolis, there's the density, what's going on slowly changes. And I think there's a change point somewhere at like the 33rd area where it goes from some kind of urban standard along the river to something a little bit less urban. And then when you get out further, like in Anoka or wherever, it becomes even, very almost rural, right? And one of my question is, with Brooklyn Center being so close to kind of the core cities, is there any reason to believe that any of that urban density that's in the 3300 block and below to reach further north, maybe to just south of the 694 bridge? And I'm thinking whether that's on the Brooklyn Center or the Fridley side, or if that's, I don't know if that's Columbia Heights, if it's probably Fridley. I think Dan, you probably know what I'm talking about, correct?
I think, are you referring to the Merca districts along the river?
That might be it. Yeah.
Yeah.
Districts,
Because
I'm not sure what the names are.
Yeah, because the issue of density is a big planning issue, and how you plan your community for the sort of density and development you want. But I'll let the planners speak to that. But the districts that are assigned for Brooklyn Center were based on existing development patterns. And so when we wrote these rules, we were very careful about creating new districts and standards that were very similar to what had been in place going back to 1976 in the original executive order that sort of put in place the first set of regulations for the critical area. So, you have two districts, the river neighborhood, which is shown in yellow, and that sort of amber color, which is separated from river. And as was mentioned earlier, that separated from river district really doesn't have really any very specific standards at all. It's mostly underlying zoning. But the river neighborhood district was established to, and the standards that go along with that, to try to minimize any nonconformities for the existing development in that area. So it was really recognizing what was already there. I hope that answers your question.
Is that, are those guidelines, or are those rules, or are those laws, or?
The standards
Because
for
Brooklyn Center is eventually going to, at some point, 10 years down the road, 50 years down the road, is going to be kind of more of an urban place just because of its proximity to Minneapolis.
Mm-hmm. Well, the standards that go with districts, there are three standards that the districts generally regulate. One is building height, two is setback from the water, and setback from the bluff. And other than that, all the other regulations in the critical area ordinance apply to all districts. So it's just those particular standards, height and setback from river, setback from bluff, that vary by district. And there are, if there's a need to change these districts at some point in time, it's possible to do that. It's through an expedited rulemaking process, so it's a little faster than the original rulemaking process that led to these rules. But that is something that can be done over time if cities want to adapt to different housing or development styles.
And if I can, let me know if you guys can hear me, and apologies for all the tech issues. This is Mike. I think kind of what Dan was alluding to is a really important piece to that. Even as density, let's assume that it does continue to increase and kind of move north from Minneapolis, as your question alluded to. Regardless of that density, the MRCA and shorelands will provide those protections along the waterfront and kind of within those different areas too, regardless of what the underlying zoning is. So MRCA and shoreland supersedes any underlying zoning, and regardless of what that underlying zoning is, those restrictions or those regulations will still be in place. Just to further reiterate that.
Yeah, these same regulations are in place in Minneapolis now. They've already adopted their ordinance. So,
Dan, and it looks like then kind of a question around who kind of manages or responsible for erosion prevention?
that is really the property owner's responsibility. You know, that is clearly a landowner responsibility. Conservation districts or other resource agencies offer assistance for this sort of thing, maybe a watershed district organization. It sort of depends on where you are. It's a bit hit and miss, but there are resources available to help manage erosion. In some cases, there are some assistance dollars depending on the organization. But that's one of the concerns in this stretch of the river, is that there, especially with the boats and the erosion that's taking place, a number of people have tried to, are asking about riprap or other sorts of hard armoring of their shoreline to protect it. We advocate sort of for a more natural approach. In many cases, there's a lot of natural engineering or that techniques that can help stabilize a shoreline but keep vegetation in place. But those are, those require technical experts and skills to do that sort of thing. But it is incumbent on the property owner to protect their shoreline.
And there's a follow-up question kind of defining riprap, which is a great question. In essence, that's kind of using, large rock or almost kind of like rubble to some degree, but kind of large rock as an erosion prevention or sometimes an aesthetic measure along that shoreline. So if you've kind of gone along a water body shoreline, you see kind of a series of kind of rocks built up along the shore. That's kind of the term for that is that riprap term.
Right, and riprap is used to stabilize shorelines. I would like to differ that it is not an aesthetic treatment. And in fact, the MRCA regulations significantly limit how much riprap you can put on a shoreline. If you go upriver a little bit, you'll get an eye full of riverbanks just full of riprap, and there's no natural anything left on those riverbanks going up 30, 40 feet. So that's part of the critical area's purpose, is to protect the natural resources, the water quality, and the aesthetic resources of the river. So the aesthetic is an important piece of the purpose for these set of regulations, and so we do have limits on the size of riprap as well as on retaining walls as well. And those are in the land alterations section of the draft ordinance, the draft MRCA ordinance that the city has out there.
Mm-hmm. And I think then too, kind of that follow-up question of kind of where can kind of people put kind of riprap in relation to the high water mark. And again, that ordinance that Dan mentioned, the draft MRCA ordinance, will give guidance around exactly that question. Question, this might be outside of all of our purviews. Camping on the island. Any insight either from the city or Dan around camping on the island, or who would make that decision?
I don't know.
Yeah. Apologies to the asker of that question, but cool.
So Stacy asked a question about, can we put rocks, or I'm assuming you mean riprap, Stacy, above the high water mark and below the high water mark? And the answer is yes. When you go below the ordinary high water level, though, you do need to follow DNR best practices to do that. In some cases, you may need a permit, but the person to talk to about that is what's known as an area hydrologist. You can contact me, or maybe city staff would know how to find that person, but they're the person you should talk to before you start putting in riprap below the ordinary high. Rocks too. I mean, it's any sort of hard armoring involving hard material below the water level, ordinary high, sorry, does require a DNR permit or approval.
Cool. And Stacy, I'll give me 1 second and I'll find that the information for the area hydrologist. I was just looking at that a minute ago. But in the meantime, Diane was asking kind of how Brooklyn Park to the north was working with residents on erosion shoreline, that there may be some DNR assistance with that. Dan, are you aware of kind of any assistance that DNR might be providing?
No, that's generally, that sort of work is usually done by a watershed organization or a conservation district. We do have a lot of guidance on how to do that. I have the area hydrologist that you can contact. I'll put it in the chat box here. I just need to find his phone number. So,
But I have it here as well too, Dan, on the link from July.
oh, okay, who is that person?
It is listed, and sorry, I just put it in. Let's see, it would be Region 3. This would be Metro North. Lucas Young.
Yeah, he's been he's moved to another location in the state. So there's an acting person there that I'll just put in the chat box for contact.
Okay, cool. So, if there's any last kind of minute questions too, and again, I appreciate everyone for kind of continuing to ask these. I want to be mindful of everyone's time and evening while there's still some daylight for a little bit. If there is any last minute questions, feel free to drop them in there. But again, as we wrap up here, just want to first of all appreciate Dan and Colleen for making themselves available and kind of being our go-to experts. Really appreciate you both keeping some time this evening to be with us. But of course, everyone who's on the call as well too for spending your evening kind of learning about this and the impacts of it and the role that zoning can play within these protections too. So as was mentioned earlier, there will kind of be some follow-up opportunities and some additional outreach and engagement and education that'll be happening over the coming months and weeks as continue moving the zoning code towards actual kind of formal presentation to different kind of leadership bodies within the city, the Planning Commission, and then eventually to the City Council for adoption in the coming months. But in the meantime, of course, there'll be plenty of opportunities to continue looking at this, and even after approval. And I'm not sure if we mentioned this, but to be done well, the zoning code should be a living, breathing document that can continue to be updated and revised as needed. So this is by no means ever meant to be, we've completed it, we've got the perfect zoning code. There'll always be opportunities to kind of revise and stuff further. So with that in mind, thank you again, everybody. We'll be putting this recorded webinar up on the project website, which again, I think Hyla put into the chat earlier on in the meeting. But until then, appreciate it. Feel free to check out that website. Again, the link's on the screen. And truly do thank you, and hope you all have a wonderful evening.
Thank you.
Thank you, everyone. Good night.
Thanks, everybody. Have a good night.